Across the street, in front of a packed restaurant, a dirty, skinny girl clutched her stomach. No one saw her or pretended not to. Then she walked in, made her way to the counter, and said firmly, "Excuse me, sir, may I wash dishes in exchange for any leftovers?" The dining room fell silent. Some people snickered, others averted their eyes. The owner simply stood up. What he did next, no one there ever forgot. The morning was grey, like so many others in that city, where hurry swallowed every sign of humanity. The wet sidewalks reflected the hurried shuffle of expensive shoes. Umbrellas crossed without notice, and no one recognized the girl standing before the restaurant window, staring fixedly at the day's specials. Julia's face was streaked with dust, her hair tangled, her clothes 2 sizes too small. Her eyes, however, were huge, alert, hungry, carrying the silent pain of someone who had long since learned not to expect anything. Her stomach growled, betraying yet another day when bread was a distant luxury. Still, she hesitated. On the other side of the glass, waiters moved with practiced ease, steaming plates threaded through the dining room, soft laughter filling the air. The smell of hot food was almost unbearable. It wasn't just hunger. It was the cruel longing to belong, even for a few minutes, to a place where people were seen. Taking a deep breath, Julia pushed open the glass door. The little bell tinkled, announcing her presence, and immediately dozens of eyes speared her like arrows. A woman at the corner table clutched her purse. A man wrinkled his nose, muttering something like, "Where are her parents?" But she held her gaze steady and walked up to the counter. "Sir, I just wanted a plate of food. I can wash dishes, sweep the floor, anything. I just want to eat." The waiter hesitated. He glanced toward the back of the restaurant, where a man was watching the scene with an impassive expression. Richard, the restaurant's owner, was used to making quick decisions, and this didn't seem like one he could rush. He could have simply ordered her out, avoided the embarrassment, protected the restaurant's image. But there was something in the girl's voice, in the way her hands trembled from cold and shame, that disarmed him. "Bring her a full meal," Richard said, his tone curt but resolute. "Same as table 4. An uneasy silence spread across the room. The waiter blinked in surprise, then complied. Julia didn't understand at first. She blinked rapidly, as if to confirm she'd heard correctly. "Sit over there," Richard added, nodding toward a discreet table in the corner. "You may wait there." She crossed the floor, as if it were a minefield. She sat down slowly, hands in her lap, eyes fixed on the plate that would soon arrive. When the waiter brought her plate, rice, beans, a steak with onions, French fries, and a glass of juice, Julia's eyes shone as though a light had been lit inside her. She ate slowly, unhurried, as if savoring not just the food, but the respect. Every so often she looked around, wary, afraid she'd be scolded or dragged away. But no one bothered her. Only Richard, from a distance, continued to watch. He didn't know why he'd made that choice. He only knew something was wrong with the world when a child had to beg to wash dishes for her meal. And something even more wrong in the reactions around him, the customers' complicit silence, the polite chill of the waitstaff, the invisibility with which that girl had been treated before he spoke up. When she finished, Julia stood and walked back to the counter, her eyes lower than before. "Thank you, sir. Truly. God bless you." And before anyone could reply, she turned and left. The door closed behind her, and a fine rain began to fall upon her frail frame. She pulled the hood of her worn sweatshirt over her head and walked on, stepping through puddles as if she knew every shortcut to survival. Richard stood still, stunned. The scene would not leave his mind. Those eyes, that broken voice, that quiet dignity with which she'd eaten and given thanks. He looked out the window and saw Julia fading into the distance, rounding the corner, invisible to the world again. Something inside him stirred. An old feeling, long buried, rose with force. Forgotten memories, of another rain, another cold, another hunger. Without thinking, he grabbed his coat, threaded through the tables and stepped out into the street. The rain hit his face, cold and insistent. From a distance, he caught sight of Julia turning down a side alley, her short steps hunched against the wind, and he followed. The rain was growing heavier, making the streets even emptier, greyer. Richard followed at a distance, careful to keep track of Julia's footsteps. With every turn, every alleyway, his heart clenched. That little girl, far too small for so much suffering, wove through the city's forgotten guts as if she already knew the maze of invisibility. She slipped through a gap between two abandoned buildings, vanishing from view for a few seconds. Richard hesitated. This place was so far removed from his world, yet something stronger than discomfort drove him onward. Rounding the corner, he came upon a sight he would never forget. A crumbling structure draped in torn tarps and makeshift boards. Windows were covered with cardboard, and the door was just a heavy cloth hung by wires. Julia had slipped inside, her home, or what was left of it. He leaned lightly against a lamppost and waited. Low voices drifted out, a woman's, weary and trembling, then Julia's, speaking in muffled excitement about the plate of food. Richard closed his eyes. He imagined the inside, damp walls, constant cold, rats in the corners, and a mother forcing herself to seem strong for her daughter. He returned home in silence. That night dragged on endlessly. The past he'd buried under layers of success and convenience kept surfacing. He dreamed of a park bench, a wet blanket, the face of a man who once handed him bread without asking questions. The next morning, Richard arrived at the restaurant early. He bought fruit, rice, beans, pasta, soap, and a package of filled cookies. He put everything in a bag and, without telling anyone, slipped back out. He retraced the same streets, eyes alert, heart heavy. At the alley, unseen, he left the bag propped against the hanging cloth door. He tapped twice on the makeshift wooden wall and slipped away. Hours later, Amanda pushed aside the cloth and spotted the bag. She glanced around, suspicious. No one in sight. She took the package inside, cautious. When she opened it and saw what was inside, she broke down. She sat on the floor, tears in her eyes, clutching the cookies to her chest. It was more than food. It was someone silently saying, "I see you." In the days that followed, Richard repeated the gesture. Always at dawn, always in silence. Each bag brought a little dignity, a little relief. Soap, powdered milk, tomato sauce. Sometimes a toy that had been forgotten in some closet. A box of crayons. Julia was the first to realize it wasn't a miracle. She began waking up earlier, peeking through the crack in the cloth, trying to catch a glimpse of the invisible angel. She never did. But she felt, more than she saw, that it was someone who truly cared. One afternoon, she pulled a crumpled sheet from an old notebook and used the new crayons to draw. She didn't write much. Just 3 words, carefully scribbled, almost trembling. "Thank you for seeing us." Beside them, she sketched 2 simple faces, a girl with braids and a weary-eyed woman. The next day, when she found the new bag, Julia left the note there, weighted down with a stone, and raced back inside. Richard spotted the paper as he rounded the corner. He bent down, read the words, and felt his throat tighten. The drawing was simple, but it screamed everything he had felt years ago. He slipped the note into his coat pocket as if it were a treasure. That night, Richard couldn't sleep. He sat in his dark living room, the note in his hands. Something had changed. Something inside him was being remade. The past he had always carried in silence was now becoming a bond linking him to those 2 forgotten lives. The next morning, the bag was no longer just a bag. Inside, alongside the bread and milk, he placed a small note of his own, signed simply with an E. "You are not alone." Richard's note had been the turning point. "You are not alone." Amanda read those words over and over in the days that followed, as if searching for a catch, a trick, an illusion. But there was none. It was simple, it was direct, and it was true. For the first time in many years, someone saw her and her daughter as more than just their poverty. By the end of that week, Julia returned from the restaurant, clutching a new piece of paper. It was an invitation, neatly written. "We would like to host you both for a special lunch this Sunday. No strings attached, no obligations, just to be together. Richard." Amanda hesitated. The idea of sitting in a restaurant as paying customers felt almost offensive to her reality. She was afraid of judgment, of the shame she might feel in front of people who'd always looked at her as if she were invisible, or worse, a nuisance. But Julia looked at her with hope, as if for the first time she believed something good could last. On Sunday, they dressed in their best clothes. Amanda tied her hair back, wiped Julia's shoes with a damp cloth, and tried to smile. The walk to the restaurant was silent, as though they didn't want to wake the world, afraid it might take everything away again. When they entered, the atmosphere was calm and welcoming. The reserved table was set with care. A simple flower at its center, 2 menus tied with ribbon. Richard greeted them with a warm, informal smile, as if they'd known each other for years. "Make yourselves comfortable. You don't need to order anything today. Just sit back and enjoy," he said softly. The waiter brought hot dishes, fresh juice and dessert. Amanda hesitated with each bite, as if she didn't deserve such kindness. Julia, eyes shining, savored every mouthful, as if tasting a dream. During lunch, Richard asked very few questions. He wanted them to feel at ease, but when Amanda, embarrassed, mentioned she'd once worked as a kitchen helper many years ago, he seized the moment. "Then maybe you can help me," he said. "I need someone to support the kitchen in the mornings. Nothing heavy, just basic tasks. What do you think?" Amanda froze. Her first instinct was to refuse. Fear spoke up. "I'm not sure I can do it. It's been so long." "We'll learn together, and it doesn't have to start immediately. Think it over," Richard said without pressure. "I just want you to know there's a place for you here." Julia, across the table, reached under the cloth to squeeze her mother's hand. It was the first time she'd seen an adult offer something without expecting anything in return. Hope took shape in that simple touch. On their way out, Richard walked them to the door. "Julia, you're not in school yet, are you?" "No," she replied, staring at the floor. "I have a friend who runs a community school nearby. I've spoken with him. If you'd like, you can start next week." The girl's eyes widened. Amanda looked at Richard, torn between disbelief and emotion. They weren't used to promises that actually came true. "Really?" Julia asked, not daring to hope. "It's more than real. It's your right. We're just getting started." That night, Amanda barely slept. She thought of all the times she'd been turned away, humiliated, ignored. She thought of her daughter, who deserved a better world. She thought of Richard and the mystery of his generosity. For the first time in years, she felt that maybe, just maybe, she no longer had to survive. She could finally live. On Monday morning, Amanda arrived at the restaurant early, wearing a simple blouse and clean jeans. Richard greeted her with a smile, showed her the kitchen, and introduced her to the staff. "Here's your uniform," he said, handing her an apron embroidered with the restaurant's logo. Amanda held the fabric as if it were made of gold. She traced the stitched letters with her fingertips, took a deep breath, and slipped into the apron in the locker room. Seeing herself in the mirror, tears came, silent, steady. It wasn't the cloth, it wasn't the job, it was the respect, it was the chance. It was feeling human again. She wiped her eyes, smoothed her hair, and walked out. For the first time in many years, her head held high. The restaurant was beginning to breathe with a new rhythm. Amanda's presence in the kitchen felt natural already, and her quiet but dedicated manner had earned the team's respect. Julia, meanwhile, had been attending the community school for 2 weeks. Every morning she'd stop by the restaurant before class, receive a lovingly wrapped snack and one of Richard's smiles. One of those mornings, Julia arrived extra early. Richard was still straightening tables when he saw her come in, clutching her notebooks. "Did I get here too early?" she asked awkwardly. "It's never too early for coffee and cheese bread," he replied, pulling out a chair. "Have a seat." They sipped their coffee in silence for a few minutes. Julia studied every detail of the restaurant as if it were a magical place. The bookshelves, the artwork on the walls, the smell of bread coming out of the oven. Finally, she asked in a low voice, "Why do you help us?" Richard stopped stirring his coffee. He took a deep breath. He'd rehearsed that answer, but it still hurt to say, "Because one day somebody did that for me," he answered. Julia frowned. "You?" He nodded with a small smile. "I grew up on the streets. Until I was 12, I lived in parks, slept in cardboard boxes, ate leftovers from the market. I was the kid everyone avoided, the one adults ignored, the one other kids were scared of." Julia said nothing. She just listened, her eyes fixed on him. "One winter day, I was sitting outside a bakery, freezing and starving. A man came out, looked at me for a few seconds, and handed me a warm roll wrapped in a napkin. He didn't say a word. He didn't ask anything. He just gave it to me and walked away." He paused, staring at his cup. That roll changed everything, not because of the food, but because he saw me. After that, I started to believe I could get out of that life, that my story could be different. I held on to that. Richard stood and walked to a cabinet behind the counter. He came back holding a small object, an old leather bookmark, the inscription barely legible. "You have value." "That was with the roll," he explained. "I've kept it ever since. It reminds me where I came from, and why I must never forget those still out there." Julia took the bookmark carefully, as if it were a sacred relic. She traced the worn letters with her fingertips, tears brimming in her eyes. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "It's yours now," Richard said, gentle but firm. "Because you're going to do what I couldn't, tell this story." Julia's eyes went wide. "Me? You told me you like to write, to draw, and I see how you look at the world. You have a story that needs to be told. I think you already know that." She was silent for a moment, then pressed the bookmark to her chest and gave a shy smile. "I've always wanted to write my story someday. Not to play the victim, but to show that there are people like you out there, that hope still exists." Richard nodded. It felt like the circle was closing. The little girl who'd once walked in hungry, offering to wash dishes for a meal, was now declaring with steady voice that she intended to tell her own story, not for pity but to inspire. "When you write that book," he said, rising, "save the first page for me. I want to see my name in the acknowledgements." "It'll be the first thing I write," she promised, smiling with her whole heart. That day, Richard went back to work with a lightness he hadn't felt in years. And Julia went to school, the bookmark tucked inside her notebook like a talisman. Her story was still unfolding, but now she knew one thing for sure. She was not alone. The days began to take on color. Julia, now a student at the community school, woke each morning with a new enthusiasm. At first, she felt out of place. Her clothes were the simplest, her notebooks the most worn, but it took only a few classes for her teachers to notice something rare in her, a quiet intensity, raw talent, and an urgent need to express herself. In her backpack, she always carried the old bookmark Richard had given her. It was her symbol of hope, her silent reminder. With it, she wrote the first entries of what she called her survival diary. There she jotted down memories, The musty smell of the building where she lived, the drip-drip of leaks at night, the days she pretended not to be hungry so her mother wouldn't worry. But she also drew smiling faces, a hot plate of food, an outstretched hand. For the first time she was shaping her own narrative. Richard encouraged her without saying much. He'd simply drop by now and then to ask, "Did you write today?" or "Want a fresh notebook?" He knew that more than food or shelter, Julia needed a voice and space. As Julia blossomed with words and sketches, the restaurant itself began to change. There was no announcement, no campaign, no renovation, just an invisible but palpable movement. It started with a simple gesture. Noticing a homeless man lingering outside, Richard slipped a hot plate out to a small side table by the entrance. No sign, no fanfare, just a warm meal and a bottle of water. The next day, he did the same, and the next. Within a week, that little table had become known, silent, humble, consistent. No one spoke of it, but everyone saw it. It was Julia who suggested taking it further. "What if we put some books there too?" she asked. "Sometimes, when your stomach's full, your mind still needs a story." Richard loved the idea. He pulled some donated books from the restaurant's old collection, bought a few second-hand, and built a small shelf beside the table. A simple sign hung above, "Sharing Corner, take what you need, leave what you can." Customers began to notice, at first with suspicion. But gradually something shifted. Loud chatter gave way to softer conversations. Glances became more attentive. A couple started bringing books to leave on the shelf. An elderly woman donated a basket of fruit with a note, "For anyone who needs to start their day with dignity." There were no rules, no judgments, just a space where empathy was served alongside the lunch special. Richard adjusted Amanda's schedule so she could help keep the sharing corner organized. She even began sorting gently used clothing to leave there. A long-time patron, moved by what he saw, donated a larger bookcase. Another offered Wi-Fi access for anyone who wanted to study there for a few hours. What began as a single plate of food had grown into a small ecosystem of care. One afternoon, a neighborhood girl stopped at the shelf. She browsed the books, picked out one with a bright cover, and bumped into Julia. "Did you draw this?" she asked, pointing to a mural beside the shelf, a simple sketch of a girl holding a book and a spoon. "That was me," Julia said shyly. "It's beautiful. You draw really well." Julia beamed, a full, unguarded smile. That night, after closing, Richard sat alone at the sharing table and flipped through one of Julia's notebooks left on the counter. On one page was a drawing of him from behind, handing a plate to a shadowed figure. Beneath it, in tiny script, read, "When no one else saw me, he saw me. That saved more than my hunger." He closed the notebook carefully and looked around. The restaurant was the same tables, same chairs, same counter, but something new pulsed within its walls, as if each tile had absorbed a bit of the transformation unfolding day by day, quietly. There were no grand speeches, no spotlight charity. It was genuine sharing. It was bread and story together. It was respect disguised as routine. And the most beautiful part? No one needed to know who had started it. All that mattered was that it continued. The days began to gain color. Amanda no longer walked with her gaze to the ground. Her body still bore the marks of poverty and fatigue, but her shoulders were steadier, her posture more upright. At the restaurant she was respected, called by name, consulted in kitchen decisions. In the evenings she carefully styled her hair, and on weekends she tidied the house with more care, even though there was still almost nothing there. But what had truly changed was invisible to the eye. She had come to believe again that she had worth. Julia, for her part, was no longer just the quiet girl sketching in the corner of the classroom. Now she spoke up in school circles, read her texts aloud to classmates, and brought her drawings to her teachers. She wrote as one who plants seeds. Each page of her diary was a seed. And finally, the soil was fertile. Richard watched her growth in silence, like someone tending something rare, with no rush, and he increasingly felt that his mission wasn't just to feed, it was to witness. It was Julia who had the idea for an exhibition. "I want to show my drawings," she said. "But not just mine. I want to tell other children's stories too. From the streets, from shelters, of those we never see." Richard nodded without hesitation. He knew that this restaurant, which once served plates, now served causes, and this one he would wholeheartedly support. The idea grew quickly. Julia designed posters with help from her school, gathered testimonials from other children, and wrote short texts sharing their stories. A girl who dreamed of becoming a nurse but sold candy at the traffic light. A boy who wanted to play guitar but used the strings to tie together worn-out sandals. Richard cleared one wall of the restaurant and turned it into a gallery. Customers noticed the preparations, and excitement spread through the neighborhood. On Saturday afternoon, the exhibition opened. Chairs filled the dining room, soft instrumental music played in the background, and a makeshift microphone stood center stage. Julia's drawings covered the wall like windows into forgotten worlds. The printed texts in bold letters carried lines that pierced the heart. "I'm 9 years old and I already know the taste of rejection. Every time I speak, it feels like nobody listens. My greatest fear is growing up without anyone ever calling me by my name." The audience, neighbors, loyal customers, and school teachers listened in profound silence. Julia climbed the small stage with trembling knees. She held her diary and the old bookmark, now tied with a red ribbon. She took a deep breath and read, "Sometimes pain doesn't scream. It whispers. It sits beside us, steals the place of our dreams, and dresses itself in silence. I was that pain. I thought no one would see me. But one day, someone did. And that changed everything." Emotion swept through the room. No one moved. Richard, leaning against the wall, felt his chest tighten. He wasn't one to cry easily, but in that moment, a single tear slid down his cheek. Julia continued, her voice steady. "Today I feel seen. Today I have a name." The words echoed through the room like a stone thrown into a lake, sending ripples through every corner and, for an instant, touching each soul present. In the front row, Amanda pressed a handkerchief to her face, proud, renewed. Richard stood motionless, simply observing. It was like watching a flower bloom through the cracks in the pavement. When Julia finished, the audience rose to their feet in applause. But it wasn't rehearsed. It was a genuine standing ovation. Those claps weren't just for Julia, they were for all the voices she represented. As people filed out, neighborhood children asked to read the texts and see the drawings. An elderly woman left an envelope filled with colored pencils and fresh paper. A local shopkeeper offered display space in his storefront for their works. Thus, the restaurant became more than a place to eat. It became a listening post, a silent beacon for voices that had long called out in the dark. Later, after the lights were off and the dining room was quiet again, Julia stayed alone before the mural for a few minutes. Richard approached her softly. "Thank you for doing this," he said. She smiled without taking her eyes off her drawing. "I just gave shape to what was already there. Those voices were always here. They just needed someone to say, 'Speak, I'm listening.'" Richard nodded. In that moment, he understood completely. True revolutions make no noise. They happen between a spoon and a sentence, between bread and words. Time passed as it does for those who learn to live with dignity, quietly, steadily, and transformatively. Julia was now 16. Her hair was longer, her body stronger, her gaze surer. She continued studying, writing, and drawing, but she also worked part-time at the restaurant, helping serve guests and guiding newcomers at the sharing corner. The old bookmarks still accompanied her, kept in a case beside her pens and scrap paper. She already had plans for her first book. She wanted to blend text and illustration, telling true stories of other children like her. She even had a title, Before the Name. Amanda had become a cornerstone of the kitchen. Respected, beloved, she knew the name of every co-worker and supplier. She'd begun to smile often, and everyone said her cooking was the best in the house. But she'd reply that the secret ingredient was knowing none of them had to hide their pain anymore. Richard remained the same man, and, at the same time, someone entirely different. The restaurant grew, but not in the conventional sense. It grew inward, like roots. It became a model for other small businesses, inspiring spaces of care in neighboring districts. Occasionally, a journalist would show up to interview the man who feeds without asking questions, but Richard never liked being photographed. He preferred the behind-the-scenes work, ensuring everything stayed true to its original spirit, simple, direct, without fanfare. One ordinary Tuesday morning, while wiping down the counter before opening, Richard noticed something across the street. A boy, no older than 10, was watching the restaurant in almost the same way Julia had years before, hungry eyes, hands shoved into pockets, trying to go unnoticed. He didn't move right away. He simply watched, as if waiting for confirmation of a déjà vu. The boy was barefoot. His cheeks were smudged, his expression caught between fear and hope. Richard went into the kitchen. He prepared a simple yet complete plate. Rice, beans, ground beef, cooked vegetables, and a banana. He also grabbed a bottle of water. On a small slip of paper he wrote, "You are not alone." He tucked the folded note beneath the napkin, set the plate on the sharing corner table, and went back inside. He didn't stay to see the reaction. He already knew that sometimes true care needs anonymity to remain pure. A few minutes later, the plate was gone. From the restaurant doorway, without a word, Julia had watched it all. Leaning in the frame, arms crossed, eyes shining. She knew exactly what that gesture meant. It was more than food. It was continuity. She approached Richard, who was straightening some dishes. "Did you see?" she asked with a slight smile. "I did," he replied without looking directly at her. "And you?" Julia nodded. They stood in silence for a few seconds. "It's strange," she said. "I don't remember the taste of the plate you brought me that day, but I remember exactly how I felt when I saw it arrive." Richard stopped arranging the dishes and finally met her gaze. "The taste fades. The gesture doesn't." She smiled, a grown-up smile, layered with meaning. She returned to her notebook, scribbled a few words, and slipped it into her pocket. At the end of the day, after the tables had been stacked, the lights turned off, and the smell of food gave way to silence, Richard walked to the little shelf of the sharing corner. A new book lay there, left by some customer, and a drawing taped next to it. Simple, made with colored pencil, it showed one hand extending a plate toward a smaller hand. Below, in a child's handwriting, "One day, I want to be what you were to me." Richard removed his glasses, ran a hand over his face and smiled. He left the drawing there, no framing needed. It was already etched in his heart. Across the street, the boy who had received the plate was still peeking, half hidden. Julia spotted him. Their eyes met for a second. She didn't wave. She made no gesture. She simply smiled, a whole light smile, as if to say, "I know how it feels." And in that instant, the cycle was confirmed. The wheel of empathy, powered by almost invisible gestures, kept turning. No speeches, no promises, just action. I hope you enjoyed today's story. If you did, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more stories like this. Leave a like and comment below what you thought about the story. See you in the next video.